work on is what do they mean by its respect, the government's respect. Okay, does that mean how the politicians actually act? Does that mean how the Constitution is written? What does that mean? That's an interesting thing. I'm not sure if I have an idea on how to unpack that yet. But anyway, a government's legitimacy is determined more by its respect for popular sovereignty than individual rights. Now, it's a more than claim. It's not claiming that individual rights don't have a point, but it's their weightiness, their importance isn't as important as popular sovereignty. Now, what does popular sovereignty mean? Wow. Popular sovereignty is generally understood to mean something like the consent. Now, the consent of whom? Of everyone? Of the governed? Of the majority? Of the plurality? Of the select? And if you have anything less than universal, what is the criteria for determining whose consent matters? And then more importantly, what is the justification for that criteria? These are some of the questions that come up here. Popular sovereignty. By and large, I will tend in my talk this evening to think of popular sovereignty in terms of consent. Now, there are all sorts of interesting moves in political philosophy, and if you get a chance to ask me about discourse ethics or idealized inquiry, I'll tell you some interesting ideas that our socialist friends have about this term. But that being said, I'm going to understand popular sovereignty as consent. And then it says, than individual rights. And of course, individual rights are the important and powerful and controversial term here. I'm going to say a lot more about rights, but I just want to note on two things here. Rights, the word rights is used here as a noun. It's not used as an adjective or a predicate adjective. It's used as a noun. Okay, a right, an entitlement, a claim. And individual rights, something about being an individual that has something to do with being rights. Now, it may be more than just being an individual. I mean, there may be an individual rock, but we might not say a rock has rights. Okay? But anyway, it has something to do with it. So, now, I'm aware from my debating days that debaters often try to have unique or eccentric definitions of terms. I think someone told me earlier this evening people try to develop squirrely cases. I guess that's the term of use. And maybe that'll be an issue. But I'm going to proceed in a fairly straightforward manner. In other words, I'm going to take this resolution as asking, what is it for a government to be legitimate? And then it's saying that in answering the question, what is it for government to be legitimate? Popular sovereignty, that is the consent of someone or everyone, is more important than individual rights. Okay, that's how I understand the topic. Now, if you have in front of you the handout called Political Philosophy, I really had to work very hard. All I did was take the front page of my course in political philosophy and reproduce it. And so that's where this came from. Okay, just maybe some interesting things about political philosophy and indeed thinking about theoretical issues that might be important to you. First of all, political philosophy is not ultimately about the history of political thought. Though political philosophers pay close attention to what past and present political philosophers have argued, that is not the primary concern. Philosophy is not concerned with what men have thought, but how the truth of things stands. It's my favorite statement from Thomas Aquinas. And this concern can be expressed for political philosophy in terms of two basic and critical questions. Question one, what is the basis, if any, for distinguishing between legitimate and de facto political legal power. This is the question of institutional justification or political legitimation. So notice, there may be someone in power, there may be a set of institutions, they have the power, they can compel people to follow certain laws, or certain edicts, or certain rules, but the question is that power legitimate? Now this is a question that is as old as Western civilization. If you go back to Book 1 of Plato's Republic, and the opening question of Book 1 of Plato's Republic is, what is justice? And there's a discussion. And Socrates, you know who he is, right? Socrates starts asking questions. The old man gives a definition. Then Socrates asks a question of the old man. The old man says, I can't argue about that. That's tradition. You young guys take it off. The discussion goes on. They start debating about it. And in the discussion, of course, there's this guy, and I pronounce his name. This is how I learned it years ago. Thrasymachus comes along and says to Socrates, oh, why are you asking these questions? Don't you know that justice is just the interest of the stronger? In effect, might makes right. Power is the only thing that matters. Okay? So one of the things that this topic is involved with is the question of whether there can be any legitimation. Now we live in a world, if you're not aware of this, that is dubious about whether any political legal order is legitimate. But this question, this topic says legitimacy is determined. So this resolution says legitimacy is determined. It's not saying that there isn't any such thing, or it's not asking, I should say, is there a legitimate political order? It's assuming there can be, and it's an argument about what the standard is. You with me? It's not, I mean, you can stand back and say they're all illegitimate. It's all a power game. And you can have that debate. And that's an interesting, important, and vital debate. But I take this topic as saying, no, legitimacy. There's something called legitimacy when it pertains to government. Okay, there's something of value to it. Okay. Okay. Now the second question, and this is an important question because this will have a lot to do with how you understand individual rights. Assuming that there is a basis for legitimating a political, legal, or government, political, legal order or government, what is the nature of the connection between ethical or moral obligations and political, legal ones? In other words, what is the character of the connection between a moral or ethical claim, Xing is good or right, bad or wrong, and ought or ought not to be done, and Xing ought to be politically, legally required or prohibited. In other words, because we know something is good and ought to be done, or because we know something is wrong and ought not to be done, that statement in and of itself is not the same statement as this activity ought to be required by law, by government, or this activity ought to be prohibited. They're semantically different claims. They don't mean the same thing. And secondly, the truth of one does not by itself imply the truth of others. So we have to ask the question, what is the nature, the character of the connection between an ethical or moral claim and a political legal one, a government one in this context? Okay. Now, as I see it, political philosophy is about these two basic questions. I'm one of those philosophers that actually think that not only are there perennial truths, but there are eternal or perennial questions. And these questions pertain to who am I, what is my life for, what is government, what's its purpose? To ask what its purpose or what legitimates it is a basic question. In a way, this debate topic is a part of that grand discussion, that grand debate. Now, addressing these questions, and thank goodness you're not in my class, Because you'd have to consider theories like contractarianism, consequentialism, blah, 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 blah. They're all written out there. You should, among some of you, have a glossary, a definition of terms. They came off an article I did, which are some definitions of terms from contemporary ethics regarding different viewpoints and different approaches to how you justify questions of morality, and also how you justify questions having to do with the justification of something becoming a law. Okay, now, we don't need to go into all of that, but I want to focus on two modes of justification used to connect the ethical to the political legal. How do we go from something ought or ought not be to something must be or must not be by law? How do we do it? The two approaches are popular sovereignty, or which is I'll call consent, or individual rights. Now, consent theory has a long history. It's sometimes called contractarianism. Sometimes it's called social contract theory. In the West, we think of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, usually, when we think of social contract theory. If you're more up on contemporary philosophy, the famous Harvard political philosopher, the man that resurrected political philosophy in the 20th century, was the Harvard philosopher John Rawls, who wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. By the way, side comment here. How many of you plan to be intellectuals or academics? Okay, you will have made it when you become an industry. In other words, when they write books about you. John Rawls is an industry. Okay, so very important thinker. Anyway, he's a social contract theorist of an interesting stripe and type. Anyway, now, under popular sovereignty, that's the idea that consent has to do with what making government legitimate. Now, the consent can be actual or hypothetical. In other words, there really was a point in time in which some set of individuals met and they consented. And so it's a claim about what actually has occurred. Or it could be hypothetical. One can say, this is what people would do if they were asked to choose. Okay? Again, there's all sorts of interesting questions regarding who is it that gives the consent? What's the criteria? How are they to judge? All sorts of great questions. But the first distinction when you're looking at social contract theory is between actual consent and hypothetical consent. The next important distinction is between what we call substantive and procedural social contract theory. Substantive social contract theory says that the social contract or the consent is the only thing that warrants or legitimates. There are no standards of right, wrong, good, or bad, either in morality or in political theory, apart from consent. Consent is the most basic idea. So if you asked, is it right or good because we consented to it? Or did we consent to it because it is right or good? Got the question? Is it right or good because we consent to it? Or do we consent to it because it is right or good? If you are a substantive social contract theorist, you're saying it's good, it's right, it's legitimate because we consent. That is rock bottom. Okay? A procedural social contract theory, or a procedural view of consent, would say, no, what social contract theory does is it sets out an account of how people would go about consenting to something, given that consent has been proven by other standards as the way to legitimate government. In other words, a procedural view of social contract or popular sovereignty would say there's some other basis for judging what makes something legitimate. And that basis tells us when it comes to government, consent is how we do it. This view then does not hold that something is right or good or legitimate because we consent to it. Rather, we consent to it because it is right, good, or legitimate. There's some standard, there's some basis. So, when you're looking at this question of popular sovereignty or consent, there's a basic philosophical question. Is consent ultimate? Here's some interesting questions to ask. Could we consent to no longer being ruled by consent? Could you guys consent that Rasmussen can be dictator? Are there any limits on consent? And maybe most importantly, why does consent legitimate? What is the difference between me consenting? You look like you need some help. Okay. Okay. Here's some money here. Do I have money here? Money. Left on my money. Yeah, here. You look like you need $1. Okay. Okay. Mike freely consenting to give him that. Okay. Okay. And someone coming in saying, Rasmussen, this guy is poor, and they say you either give him $1 or we're going to, beat you up or throw you in jail. And I get, what's the difference? What's the moral difference between me on my own deciding to give you $1 and me giving you $1 because these guys are going to beat the heck out of me if I don't give you the $1? Is there a moral difference? What is that difference? Why is consent legitimate? Okay? Sure, you want to say something? Go ahead.
What does that have to do with the idea of freedom to will what you want? I guess part of it has to do with the right to property, and part of it has to do with you being able to control what you do and what you think is moral.
What I'm asking is, why is it good to will what you want? What legitimates that? I will, I'm going to pick on you, okay? I will that this guy becomes my slave. Okay, you're going to be my slave. You're going to tote and carry that barge and do everything I say. And if he doesn't, I'll beat the holy you-know-what out of him. Now that's my will. We usually, when we say, I have the freedom to do I want, I have the freedom to swing my arm until it comes in contact with somebody else's nose, right? So there's a principle that judges the will, that judges the consent. Okay? So that's the interesting question. The question is, I'm not necessarily saying that consent isn't vital, if not even the most important thing for, legitimating government. I'm asking the question, and maybe it's not a legitimate question, but on the face of it, it might be, what legitimates consent? Why do we say consent is the standard? Okay?
Isn't it the principle of governing yourself, self-ownership?
Well, but now you've used, in my world view, terms that are more analogous to individual rights. One of the ways of understanding individual rights is that I own myself.
So you're asking for a standard that's not individual?
No, I'm not. I'm saying the debate topic says is determined more than by popular sovereignty than by individual rights. Okay, so at least prima facie, according to the debate topic, there's a difference between popular sovereignty and individual rights. Now, this is an interesting thing. You might only want to say, try to collapse them. I don't know what kind of debate routine that would be. Okay? Because if you say this is rooted in something more than consent, and that consent is really individual rights, then you're making an argument for individual rights. I'm standing back, though, here and saying maybe individual rights and consent are different. I'm just saying, is consent foundation? I'm not saying, I'm asking, is consent foundational? Is it basic enough? Okay? When you are asked to engage in intellectual deliberation about anything, okay, you have to dig deeply. How many of you are familiar with the word radical? Do you know the Latin basis for the word radical? Root, to be at the root, to go to the foundation. To the extent that you engage in philosophical discussion, to the extent that you debate, you are all radicals. You're all potential troublemakers. I can't think of anything more prone to causing all sorts of trouble for all sorts of people in power than a bunch of philosophical debaters. Oh, you're radical. Boy, do we need you now. But anyway. Now, so the questions that I was asking is, regarding popular sovereignty, is if we understand that by consent, and if we differentiate between actual and hypothetical consent, and substantive and procedural consent, okay, what kind of theory do we have here? Now, there are different versions of this. I would argue that Thomas Hobbes was an advocate of more or less an actual substantive theory of social contract theory. Morality and justice came out of the social contract. I would argue that John Locke was an actual or hypothetical social contract theorist, but was a proceduralist. He had a more basic principle than consent. That's a matter of debate among scholars, though. You can fight about that. But that's an interesting thing. What justifies consent? Okay. Now, so that's an issue. Now, you could say that consent is all we have, and that's all we can go with. There's nothing other than consent, and that's an interesting argument. In other words, that's an argument that looks at all other ethical standards and says, no, they don't work, they don't work, they don't work, and this is what we're left with. Of course, the interesting question is, does this work? Okay, so you've got a government's legitimacy is determined more by its respect for popular sovereignty than individual rights. I picked on you already. Can you help me? I'll move this around. We're going to pivot it like this, okay? Just turn it around, all the way around. Okay, let me get this in. Okay, let's turn it around. Okay. Now let's talk about rights. Rights, as I said already, can be understood either as an adjective or a noun. When used as an adjective, the word right means something like is appropriate, is good for. That's the right thing to do. It was right that you helped the old, befuddled philosopher turn it around. He's so crippled and old. You did the right thing, okay? But it would be different to say that and say, I have a right to that assistance from you, whether I ask it for it or not. I have a right, okay? There, the word right is used as a noun. Now, ultimately, what we're interested here in this topic is really rights used as a noun. This topic is not about what's the appropriate way to live, what you ought to do with your life, how you ought to treat others. This is not a topic about social justice or human relations. This is a topic about government's legitimacy. You got me? All the topics about what social justice is, what we owe one another, what's legitimate to do for you and I, and all that's okay. But the question here is about government's legitimacy. Okay? Now this is important because this helps make us understand why the word right, when it's used as a noun, is so important. Okay, we're talking about a claim or an entitlement when I have to use the word right as a noun. And it is a moral claim. To say that I have a right is to say something about how others or how the situation ought to be. For example, if I were talking about 1952 in South Africa, and I said about the blacks in South Africa in 1952, they have a right to live wherever they want. That would have been factually wrong. There was a system of apartheid. You know what I'm talking about? But it could nonetheless be true that even though there was a system of apartheid and they didn't have and you couldn't live wherever you want because of the laws, it could nonetheless be true that they had such a right. Because when you're making a rights claim, you're ultimately talking about how you ought to be treated. And the notion of a right that you have implies certain responsibilities or obligation on the parts of others. More importantly, what this has to do, for our purposes, is it has to do with what a government's aim or purpose is. Now, if you argue that individual rights are more important than popular sovereignty, or at least equal to, that's all you'd have to do to be the negative, then what you would say is that this is a moral term that has to do with the purpose of government. Now, when we talk about rights, we can talk about basic or derivative rights. A derivative right is a right that flows from the exercise of a basic right. For example, I don't have the right to play golf at the Garden City Country Club in Long Island. Why? Because I'm a poor professor and I can't afford membership. Okay? That's not a right that I have. If I could afford membership, and assuming they'd want to have a professor or philosophy among their members, which is questionable, okay, but assuming that, and if I paid my membership and I had that contractual relationship, then I would have a right. But that would be a derivative right flowing from some more basic rights. Now, rights can also be understood in terms of the obligation they impose on others. In fact, I should say that what I'm talking about here, when I'm using the word rights, is really something that's called claim rights. That's the technical word. They put a claim on others. And the interesting question about how the word individual rights is used, it's almost always used in our culture to determine a particular type of claim. Now, who is young and good looking? Female, sorry. Okay, I see, okay, I see someone in very, okay, fine. Now, let's suppose I have a right to marry. Easy does it, easy does it. A right to marry. Now, there's two ways of understanding that obligation that is imposed on others. If we understand that as requiring a negative obligation, that no one may interfere, that no one may get in the way, that everyone must practice forbearance in my attempts to persuade some woman to marry me, okay, then okay, fine. That's one meaning of it. But what if we say, no, you don't have a mere negative right to marry, you have a positive right to marry. In other words, that others are not only obligated to refrain from interfering, but they're obligated to provide me with the means by which, or the person by which, I would be married. Now, I see some candidates here. Anyway. So anyway, you see my point? There's a difference between an obligation that is negative and an obligation that is positive. Okay, individual rights have in this country and really throughout the West have been understood as negative basic rights. Now notice, I'm talking about what is the standard for legitimating government. I'm not saying that there might not be many positive as well as negative obligations that we owe to one another, morally speaking. I mean, you really look down and out. Maybe I really should give you that $1. Right? There's all sorts of moral obligations we have. But that's not the topic. The topic is what legitimates government. Is it popular sovereignty or is it individual rights? If it's individual rights, what we usually mean then is that we're talking about a noun, an entitlement that's moral, that's basic and negative, not positive. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. But let me now give you the standard litany on what the basic negative rights are. The standard litany is that people, and this may be found, by the way, in this brilliant essay by yours truly, called Theories of Rights, in a little encyclopedia called the Encyclopedia of Libertarianism. And anyway, the idea here is that people have the right not to have their life, their liberty, or their property used without their consent. You may not. Others, the purpose of government, the aim of government, is to make sure that others, as well as the institution of government, does not use or direct a person's conduct without their consent. Notice, rights, consent. That government or others may not take on the task of choosing how to live for another person. They have that choice consistent with others having that choice. And finally, that one's resources, the things that one creates, produces, acquires, either through initial acquisition or through trade, are things that you have your control over and may not be used without your consent. Those are the basic triad of negative rights. And that's usually what's meant by the claim individual rights. Today, and we have for the last, I'd say, almost 80, 90 years in the United States, been offered another agenda where you have what is called positive rights. I'd use the phrase welfare rights, but if I use the phrase welfare rights for positive rights, people always think of poor people getting a welfare check. And more often than not, these so-called welfare checks go to big corporations and people that drive, big fancy cars. So I don't like using the word welfare rights. I like using the word positive rights. But the situation we get stuck with is this. Who has a purse? Anybody have a purse? Okay. Okay, you have a purse too. Okay. Okay. Hand me your purse. Okay, this is my purse now. Who wants to buy it from me? It's in my possession and all of that. Okay, how much will you give me? Yeah, okay, I got it.
I'll give you this paper.
Fine, okay. Now, if we live in a regime that protects basic negative rights, the law would prevent me from doing what I'm doing. Right? And so they'd say, Rasmussen, you can't do that. But let's say that I've already said I'm a poor professor, I don't have much money, I need a lot of things. And I turned out that if I take this purse and I sell it, I can make some money. And what if my representatives come and say, you know, we're going to take your purse, or the equivalent to that, to make sure that poor old Rasmussen will get along. Okay. Then the legal order, then the government would say we should take the purse. Now, we live at a time in which we have a political legal order that's saying, don't take the purse, take the purse. Don't take the purse, take the purse. And as a result, people have no idea what rights mean, which to my way of thinking is why that's come about. So people won't understand the idea. But that's another issue. Okay, thank you so much. So the issue here then for the individual rights advocate is to say, assuming that we've got this understanding of individual rights, is that rights are either as basic as consent or more basic. Or, yeah, more basic is even, I think that's a legitimate concept. Yeah, okay. So that's sort of the issue. Now, there's another big question here that I don't think you have to deal with in this topic, and that is, what is the source or the ground of rights? But maybe you do. Some people might want to say that the reason we have rights is because we consent. So if we consent to rights, then we've got them. If we don't have them. Other people might argue, no, the reason that we have rights is because of our nature as human beings. And that's called a natural rights doctrine. And then we can talk about the source of nature and all those great metaphysical questions, but I would assume you wouldn't get into that in a debate topic, okay? So you're going to have, I think, in this topic, a swing back and forth between, is consent the most basic idea, or does it require something that justifies it? And if you say no, and you say it's individual rights, then you're going to have to say individual rights are the standard, and then you're going to have to say something about what you take that standard to be. Now, I've already mentioned that brilliant article by yours truly in the Encyclopedia of Libertarianism called Theories of Rights. Okay, here's the Encyclopedia of Libertarianism, okay? Cato put it out, the Cato Institute, okay? I doubt if they'll give each of you a free copy. It's fairly expensive. But you can probably find it in any decent library. Anyway, there's an article by a philosopher by the name of Eric Mack, M-A-C-K, from Tulane University, and an article by Fred D. Miller, Jr., from Bowling Green, who are also writing about rights. My essay, the Mack essay, and the Miller essay will get you going on that. And the reason I mention these is there's also about 8 or 9 references with each of these articles. Now, to the real philosophically inclined, there's also an essay that I brought along, if I can find it here it is, by a friend of mine, and the title of the essay is Substantive Social Contracts and the Legitimate Basis for Political Authority. Okay, Substantive Social Contracts and the Legitimate Basis of Political Authority. Let me give you the title, let me give you the article, the journal rather. It's The Monist, M-O-N-I-S-T, volume 66.4, 1983, October, beginning on page 517 and ending on page 528. Oh, by the way, let me tell you something about philosophy. Philosophy is a type of knowledge that's circular. Each generation has to learn the eternal verities. It's quite possible that there's something written 200 years ago, no, 2,000 years ago, that is vital, relevant, and crucial to what's going on right now. Okay? If all you know is what you can get on the internet, so far you don't know enough. You still need to become intimate with, to have intercourse with your library on a physical basis, to know and look up articles. Now eventually, hopefully all of this stuff will be on the internet, but you need to look it up and go at it after it, okay? But that's, I think, a very good article in thinking about consent. Okay, so let me see if I can summarize what I've said. I've said that I think the Lincoln-Douglas debate resolution is ultimately asking a question about what legitimates government. So it's within the context of what legitimates government that you need to look at it. Don't get confused by arguing about personal morality or social morality or all sorts of things like that. That's important. It's a part of life. But this isn't the topic. The topic has to do with government. You've got to be fairly clear on what you mean by government. Something about a monopoly on the institution that has the use of the legitimate use of physical force in a geographic area, the so-called Weberian notion of government. I think that's what you want to do, even though you might want to play with that. Anyway, the issue then is what more than, consent more than individual rights. So that's a strong burden on the affirmative. The affirmative has to show that consent is foundational to the judgment of legitimacy, and everything else is dependent, not everything else, but at least individual rights isn't more foundational. Okay? And that's it. If you're going to advocate the individual rights view, all you have to do is show that it's at least equal to or more basic. That would seem to be how I would approach it. Now, I remember enough about debate that things are never quite as clear as you think they are when you plan them in advance. Because everybody's got a new twist, a new angle, and who knows, the girl, well, I would always get caught up looking at the girl and I'd lose my, I don't know what to say. And in fact, we won the debate championship twice in our state. But every time we went across the river, it was two Catholic girls' schools. We'd always debate. And they were always so nicely dressed and good looking, and they'd sit there so properly and just wiped us out every time. So don't know. But anyway, back on topic. You really need to think hard about these issues, okay? All I've tried to do is touch what strike me as some of the basic issues. But the reason that you go into the debate, and the reason you do this, is not only to develop your skills in speaking and thinking logically, clearly, with some confidence and all that's good. But ultimately, you learn how to research. You learn how to examine arguments. And you guys know a definition, you know the difference between a sound deductive argument and a valid deductive argument? A valid argument is one in which if the premises are true, the conclusion follows. A sound argument is when you have a valid argument plus true premises. Then you get something that not only follows logically, but is a truth. The reason you do debate, the reason you do any of these things, is because you're trying to find out, as Aquinas says, how the truth of things stands. Okay? That's something you want to do and develop. Okay? There's a lot more to be talked about, but I'll just stop right here. Thanks so much.
Yes. We're talking about how that includes a right to liberty, to life, and your property. For your definition of liberty, are you defining liberty as a right to do as you please, or a right to do what is right?
Liberty is only defined by the right. In other words, liberty is not the most basic notion. Rights are the most basic notion. So the negative right talks about what others are obligated to do in relationship to my choices, and since it's a universal claim, it also applies to what I'm obligated to do in relationship to other people's choices. What the rights do, and this is a very important point, is it says, this is back to your point, it says that there is a moral space a moral territory that belongs to the person, where their choice is sacrosanct. Okay? Notice that we're not saying that what they choose or what they do is morally right. No way, shape, or form. We're saying that's where you have this zone of choice. Okay? And that's the purpose of government, to protect that. Okay? And the way that we know when that zone of choice, when that area or zone of control is transgressed, is when we don't see the consent. Okay? So if I give him the dollar by consent, that's legit. If someone takes my dollar or compels me with a gun to do it, okay, then that's not consensual. So what rights really have to do is rights are upholding the primacy of choice or consent is the first thing when it comes to the political legal order. It's to the government. It's not saying it's the first thing that comes with community or society or personal morality or any of those things. It's just a political, philosophical point. This is an issue I have to talk about because I get so sick of people saying, yeah, but look at that choice. What that person is doing is wrong. And I go, yeah, it's wrong, but does it follow from that it ought to be a law to prohibit it? And then people get into the question, well, how do you promote goodness? How do you promote all those things? And the whole idea behind individual rights is that the aim of government ain't to make us moral. Statecraft, sorry George Will, is not soulcraft. Okay, and individual rights protect that zone. So if you want to say that liberty is based on some normative idea, I think you must, but the normative idea is rights, not what is right. In other words, the rights claim is a particular type of idea. Okay? Now, we could really spend some time here talking about how to conceive of rights. What kind of moral concept are rights? Okay, and that's really what your question raises. Oh, by the way, sidebar. Aren't you sick of people saying it begs the question when they mean raises the question? Okay, thank you. Okay, fine. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between rights and individual rights?
Well, one's just a more generic way of speaking, okay? What you need to do when you talk about rights is you say, well, why do we have them? I'd like to say something like there are natural, individual, basic, negative rights. But that's a hell of a long thing to say. But that's how I would start breaking it down, okay? And then, but see, the real philosophical thing, this is where I make a living, is trying to figure out what is it that justifies that claim. Now, it's my own view that the Constitution of the United States is based on the American Declaration of Independence. That's based on an idea that individuals have basic inherent rights. These are rights that flow from our nature as human beings. And they don't give us direction on how to live good lives. They give us direction on how to have a political legal order in which we might go about the activity of living good lives. How many know baseball? Okay. Two types of rules. Rules for playing the game well and rules for playing the game. If I up against a real good pitcher and I have a guy on second base and I need a run and there's nobody out and I'm batting, what is the most important thing I do? Assuming I'm not, a great home run hitter. I get a hit? Yeah, but maybe I can't get a hit. What's the
Get hit by the ball and walk.
Yeah, if I can get that, that would be. But that's really not good enough. What would be better? Bunting? Why?
Sacrifice bunting.
Why? What's accomplished by that?
You get out, but the other man gets a chance to score.
Well, he gets over to third base, right? If he's on second. You with me still? Now, I said you had to know something about baseball. If a guy's on third base and there's one out, what happens when you get a long fly ball?
And you sacrifice.
Tag up and score, right? So you can, by 2 outs, get a run. You with me? Sort of a complicated activity, right? What is it to play the game well? So I'm up there batting, there's a guy on second, there's no out. I either want to bunt or hit the ball to the right so the guy on second base can go to third. So if there's a long fly ball, I get a run. That's called small ball. It's playing baseball well. You with me? Sort of a complicated set of things. Think of morality as being like playing baseball well. Okay? Now, if I'm up at the plate and I'm batting, and if you know me, I'm batting, 3 strikes, I'm out. What do? If I don't run to first base, but I go back to the bench, what am I doing? What do you do when you strike out? You go back to the bench, right? You don't run to first base. Why? That's the rules of baseball. Rights are like the rules for morality. Rights don't tell you what the best thing to do in living for yourself or others is. Rights establish the context in which we go about the task of playing the moral game. Think of rights as, this is my term, meta-norms. Not norms that tell us what to do in living well, but norms that set up the context in which we go about living. That's why if you're debating about individual rights, and you say, well, I have this individual right, and people are going to say, oh, but look at all the stupid things that people do when they're free. Well, of course. That's what it means to be free. But you're saying, but morality is about teaching us to choose rightly. That's correct. That's what morality is about. But here we're not talking about morality per se. We're talking about a particular part of morality. That which has to do with political philosophy. What should government do? And when we do that, then we end up talking about things about rights and consent. You know, as I've been talking to you this evening, I've been seeing that this is a very tricky debate topic, because if I were going to argue it, I think I would argue either way, but I wouldn't make consent fundamental. In other words, I think I could take both sides, but as long as I didn't make consent fundamental, I could argue either side, which is an interesting idea about it. Yes, sir?
I thought this was about questions.
Yes, go ahead.
No, I wasn't going to ask a question, but then I was just wondering, you just start back to your topic.
Yeah, because I got suggested to that. That happens when you get old. You go back, you remember things. Yeah.
All right. You describe legitimacy as having to do with values. That's to me at least, that seems sort of like an operational definition. How would you define legitimacy itself as it relates to government?
What makes it appropriate? What makes it right? The word values to me doesn't have that squishy notion that it has in the popular jargon. Values to me are, the deeper philosophical question you're asking is, can you have values unless there's something that's valuable? Okay? Now, how many of you have read Plato? There's a dialogue called the Euthyphro. You ever hear of the Euthyphro? Is something good because it's desired, or is it desired because it's good? Is something valuable because it's valued, or is it valued because it's valuable? There's also a religious way of taking the issue too, but it's very, very, very common. But that's, yeah, so proper, right, and ultimately we're saying what makes government correct, right, just, and you could use the word just. The word justice is another one of those really words that mean all sorts of things. But if you use it in the most generic sense of just what's okay, what's good, what's right, you could ask that, put it that way.
So the affirmative team's sort of, or both teams' values would be stemming off of the idea of legitimacy. What is right? What can we perceive or measure rightness as?
Right. I mean, yeah. Right. It's extremely. Of all the topics that I've seen, I think I've seen about 3 or 4 over the years. This is the most profoundly philosophical topic that I've seen. I think anybody that ends up working on this is really going to end up being at least a minor in philosophy before they get out of college, which at our place is 18 hours, because it seems to me that you can't get into this without getting into this. Now, maybe there's some squirrely cases that can get around that, and then I've never never doubt the ability of human beings to find ways around things, especially if it's a way of avoiding work. But that's it. But no, but that's what I meant by normative, evaluative. There's more I can say on that if you want.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back to discussion groups, and we'll have the LD people come back in here, the policy people go in the classroom, and I think Dr. Keaty will be in the classroom of the policy people, and I'll be floating around. So, 5-minute break, and then come back. We want to have
Dessert in the kitchen.
and there's dessert in the kitchen. There's a dessert, a brownie, sort of special.